Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Briget Polichene, the CEO of the IIB. I'm excited to be joined today by several advisors from the Brunswick Group, one of DC's premier public affairs and advisory firms, to discuss President Biden's first 100 days in office and what we can expect from this administration in terms of domestic policy, global engagement, and financial services policy. The members of our panel discussion today all have extensive knowledge of the realities of governing and the impact of policy on business. First, we are joined by Molly Miller-Wise Miners. Molly is a partner at Brunswick's DC office, where she advises clients on public affairs and communications. Before joining Brunswick, Molly served as Chief Communications Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, and before that, she was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the Treasury Department. Molly and I also had the opportunity to work together for many years at Citi. Molly, great to see you here today. We are also joined by Patti Solis Doyle, also a partner in Brunswick's Washington DC office. I'm sure Patti's name is familiar to many of you. She is a veteran political advisor and commentator with more than 30 years of experience in politics, presidential campaigns, and public service. Patti served as an advisor to the Obama-Biden presidential campaign during the 2012 election, and during the 2008 general election, she was chief of staff for vice presidential operations. She later went on to manage day-to-day operations for then vice presidential nominee Joe Biden. Welcome, Patti. Next up, we have Doug Sosnik, another name you have likely heard over the years. At Brunswick, Doug advises a range of organizations and individuals on their critical issues. Doug served as a senior advisor to President Clinton, playing a key role in policy, strategy, political, and communications decisions in the White House. His titles there included Senior Advisor for Policy and Strategy, White House Political Director, and Deputy Legislative Director. Finally, we have Lanhee Chen. Lanhee is a senior counselor at the Brunswick Group, where he uses his policy, regulatory, and political experience to advise clients on business-critical issues in healthcare, technology, and geopolitics generally. In addition to his work at Brunswick, he is currently the David and Diane Steffi Fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution and Director of Domestic Policy Studies and lecturer in the Public Policy Program at Stanford University. This is truly an all-star lineup. So we're going to get started with Doug, who's going to share some thoughts on the state of American politics. We'll then turn to a panel discussion and try to reserve some time at the end for Q&A. So submit your questions throughout. If we can't get to them, we'll follow up. So with that, Doug.
Thank you, Briget. It's great to be here. I'm going to describe what I call the unexplainable, which is what's going on in American politics and why this is happening. I think in order to figure out where the Biden administration and politics in our country is headed, I think it's important to try to get an understanding of how we got to where we are today. And if there's just a couple of things I can leave you with as a broad point, is to understand American politics. I don't think you can look at an isolated election, including the 2020 election, and understand really what's going on in our country. And the other thing I would just say about Donald Trump is, I think of him as more of a reaction to what was going on in America rather than the cause. And so it's through that prism that I've looked at and tried to figure out and understand, which is what I'm going to talk to you about briefly, trying to explain why we're having the period of time in our country that we are. So if you go to the next slide, it's probably the first PowerPoint you've seen on politics. It quotes Vladimir Lenin, but I think it is an apt quote of there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And so I think pulling us back for just a moment, we're going through a unique period in American history that we haven't seen since the late 1800s. The cause of it centers around the 50-year decline of the middle class, which began in the early 1970s. There are a combination of things, starting with shareholder capitalism, a term you probably are increasingly hearing about as you hear more and more about stakeholder capitalism. But in the early 1980s, our capitalist system was built around the fact that the shareholder was the single most important stakeholder in our capitalism. And so our laws reflected that and started creating a bigger gap between the people at the top in companies and the people at the bottom. The second is on technology and the role that technology has played in the last 30 or 40 years in taking jobs. And the third element is globalization and trade, and how that's taking more jobs, putting more pressures on a declining middle class. And so you can look at both the 2008 economic crisis in America, and as we start hopefully coming out of the coronavirus, you've seen in 2008, and I think you're seeing now, what I would call a K-shaped recovery, which is to say that for some people, they're recovering quite well from the virus, and they did from 2008. And for the people on the bottom part of the K, they were in the worst position going into the virus, and they've been the hardest hit. So this has created a period of time of tremendous political turmoil and instability in our country with the economic pressures on the middle class. So if you go to the next slide. So if you think about the Lenin quote for a moment, we're in around day 96 right now of the year 2021. It's hard to believe in this period of turmoil how much has happened, starting with the Democrats taking control of the Senate, followed by the insurrection in the Capitol and the partisan vote about whether the election should be certified for Biden. President of the United States, Donald Trump, got impeached for the second time. We had a change of presidency and a complete change of direction in America. And we, as you all know, just recently passed almost a $2 trillion stimulus package. All this going on while over 200,000 people have died in America since the start of the year. Let's go to the next slide. So in this period of change, and where people feel like that the powerful and the institutions are not responsive to them, you've seen an alienation towards our government and towards our elected officials, which I believe not only enabled a person like Donald Trump to go to the fore on the Republican Party and become president, but also the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warrens of the world are also much more impactful in our politics now, and in some ways very similar on policies than Trump, as reaction to the failure of institutions in our government to work on behalf of the people. So if you go to the next slide. So this is, I was born, I'm probably the oldest person on this webinar. So I was born at the beginning of this chart, and this just shows you the historic decline in faith in government in America. Going back, you can see 77 was prior to John F. Kennedy's assassination. But you can see the toll over the last 50 years of a lack of confidence in our country, in our elected officials. So this is a very deeply baked in feeling of alienation towards people who run our country. Go to the next slide. And so that's reflected. Let's go back. Yeah, politics is really a lagging indicator of our country. So in other words, the country goes in a certain direction and the politics reflects that. And so it's a lagging indicator. And so you can see since the middle of the first decade of the century that, with the exception of the 2012 presidential reelection of Obama, that the country's voted against whoever is in power now for the last 7 out of the last 8 elections. So in a sense, what they're doing is they're going out every 2 years and voting against whoever they voted for 2 years earlier. Doesn't matter what political party they're in. This shows you the profound alienation that people feel towards their elected officials in this country, regardless of party. You go to the next slide. So this is, I think, the single most important map to understand American politics. It's very similar to the 2016 map. This was Donald Trump's favorite map for the 2016 election. He framed this map and put it outside the Oval Office and showed his guests this map. He loved this map because, as he would say, it shows he won in a landslide. 84% of the counties in the United States voted for him. So what's interesting about this map is that while Biden won the election by over 7 million votes in the popular vote, while he only carried 16% of the counties in America, those counties represented over 70% of the GDP in this country. And so the red areas, the areas that Trump won, tend to be disproportionately blue collar and white and older voters. The people who've been losing out in this transition from a 20th century top-down manufacturing economy to a 21st century digital global economy in which you need education to succeed. And so the blue areas here that Biden carried are areas that are disproportionately higher educated voters, younger voters, higher percentage of non-white voters. And so education and race are now the two fault lines in how to predict how someone's going to vote in American politics. If you go to the next slide, this shows you that what this is, there were 206 counties that voted for Obama in 08, Obama in 12, and Trump in 16. And what it shows is that of those 206 counties, Trump carried them all again in 2020, with the exception of 25 counties. And these are areas that he continued to carry that were these blue collar areas, the areas that were the hardest hit from the decline of manufacturing, hardest hit from technology taking jobs, hardest hit from globalization taking more jobs. And the Biden counties, what's different about the Biden coalition from the Obama coalition is that the Biden coalition is much more dependent on educated voters, suburban voters, in addition to African-American voters. But this shows you the class divisions in our country now. And you'll hear a lot about culture wars. And a lot of it is cultural for people who feel like they've been left behind. They're on the wrong shape of the K of the recovery of 08 and the virus, and been the hardest hit since 1970. And that's feeding into this cultural sense that the world is leaving them behind. And that's driving our politics. And even while Trump lost in 2020, Trumpism as a concept is still alive and well. So if you go to the next slide. So this is just a rack up of all that I've just said, which is this transformation that I mentioned starting in the late 1800s, the change of economy. It's important, this third element that it was exasperating this feeling of people being left behind is that what it means to be an American is changing. Within the next 20 years, less than 50% of people in the United States will be white, which is a profound difference from as recently as 1992 when Bill Clinton was elected president. 88% of the people who voted in that election were white. And the way I distill it down in its most overly simplistic term is half the people think the country's changing too fast, and the other half believing we're not changing fast enough. And this fifth point, I think, is a very important point if you have a business interest, particularly if you're consumer facing in any shape or form. I grew up in politics. I've been doing it a long time. There was a kind of a truism in politics which was never violated, which is publicly traded companies in particular never got involved with politics. Michael Jordan was quoted 30 years ago as saying Republicans buy tennis shoes as well as Democrats. What happened in the Trump era was corporations were forced to weigh in on cultural issues of the time. For me, growing up in the South, the notion that Walmart and NASCAR would take a position on the Confederate flag and the President of the United States would not is unimaginable. What we've been saying at Brunswick before the election, and certainly you're seeing it now since the election, is the corporations are actually going to be in a much more difficult position to deal with the politics and divisions of our time now with Biden as president than with Trump. And in some ways, Trump made it easy to take a position in terms of racism or other kinds of things. And you're looking at the voting rights issue right now that's forcing a lot of companies to take a side. And so it's going to be very, very treacherous for corporations in this environment to not be forced to try to take a side in this great cultural war. And the last thing I'll just say is you should, and it's where I started, you should view what's going on is really as much as probably as close to the beginning of the beginning as the beginning of the end. And what I mean by that is we've been going through this period of political turmoil and unrest in our country for almost 20 years. And I think as we moved in the late 1800s from an agrarian society to an industrial society, which took 30 or 40 years, I think you're going to see well into this decade, this political instability that we've now seen for the last 2 decades. I think it's going to continue throughout this decade and front and beyond. So this is going to be a very treacherous path for corporations to operate in. There's going to be a lot of political volatility, a lot of turmoil in a very divided country. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Patti. Thank you.
Actually, I think we're turning it over to Briget.
Yeah, that was really interesting, a little depressing, but very interesting. So in light of that, sort of in light of the fact that the Biden administration has to step into this incredibly divided country right now, all these different issues, I've heard a lot of people say like only Joe Biden could have won the presidential nomination, and interested, Patti, in sort of hearing your thoughts about, what they laid out on the campaign trail and why, and then how that's sort of playing out in the real world, i.e. now that they've met, a Congress and an American public where they're, putting these policies, trying to put these policies into practice.
That's a great question. I think I want to start off, and I may be showing my partisan stripes here when I say that, he's been in office for 80 some days now, and he's had a pretty good run thus far. I think if you ask him or anybody on his team, they'll tell you that he's had an outstanding run. Judging by any traditional metrics of the first 100 days for a president, he's got a job approval average of 53%, which is pretty good. He got all of his nominees confirmed, all except for one, Neera Tanden, a friend of mine, by the way. He passed a major piece of legislation, 1.9 trillion stimulus bill that Doug referred to, with relatively little drama. No big scandal except for the dogs, Biden Secret Service. So he's had a pretty good 80 days, but in terms of what he ran on, the two big things that he's run on are obviously containing COVID and looking forward to a safe recovery of the economy. I think that was his first, second, and third priority. And then the other piece was, running on healing the soul of the nation, bringing, the country back together again. And on the first piece, COVID, I think he's done, what he has promised. The vaccines have been produced. The vaccines are getting distributed. The third phase is a big marketing campaign to try and persuade people who are not necessarily thinking they're going to get vaccinated, and then to really serve the underserved communities. So I think they're check, check, and check. On the healing the soul of the country, not so much. I think as a candidate, Joe Biden really ran as someone who, as a conciliator, someone who could work across party aisles, someone who can bring both parties together for the good of the country. He wore the idea, the label of deal maker in the Obama administration, as a badge of honor. But I think they quickly found out that in this environment that Doug so eloquently laid out, bipartisanship is not really going to work. But what I do think they have done fairly well, and that is uniting the Democratic Party. They did that very well on the campaign trail, and that was because they had one goal, our party, that was defeating Trump. That was their North Star, and there wasn't really room for fights between our party and ideology. And then on the stimulus, they pretty much kept the party intact, except for Joe Manchin, and some of his demands. And I think that was because of the immediate need of the American people for this stimulus money. But moving forward, I think you're going to see not just fights between Democrats and Republicans, but real intra-party fighting on behalf of the Democrats. You're going to see that in the compromises of the infrastructure bill, and certainly legislation beyond that. I think you've already seen it with Joe Manchin saying the corporate taxes are too high, and AOC saying that it doesn't do enough. So I think moving forward, the Biden administration is going to have much more challenges than it's had thus far.
So, Molly, you know, you've been in 2 administrations. You sort of know the realities of dealing with a divided Congress. And as Patti pointed out, this is perhaps, you know, a little more unique because the division, there's sort of 2 divisions, right? There's the Republican-Democrat division, but there's also the Democrat division that's going to play out, especially, you know, moving forward, like taxes and some of the other things. What are some of your observations about the realities of doing that? And, you know, do you think that President Biden might do the same kind of pivot that we saw with President Obama and then President Trump in the last 2 years of moving, just, you know, using regulatory and executive actions to advance their agenda?
Thanks, Briget. And I'm sorry, I had Wi-Fi problems and was kicked off, so I missed all of Patti's answer. So if I repeat anything or
It was brilliant, Molly.
completely contradict her brilliant answer, I'm sorry. But I think you're right. We saw right out of the gate a number of executive orders in the first week of the Biden administration. There were, you know, over a dozen, if I remember correctly. And that's not a departure from recent administrations and out of the gate, but it's a way to immediately start putting your mark on some of these key legislative issues. Campaigning is one thing, governing is another. And it's very different once you get in, you look at this divided Congress. And to your point, it's not just Republicans and Democrats, it's Democrats against Democrats, different facets on, you know, taxes, on climate, on infrastructure, on healthcare, all these really key issues. So you're fighting against 3 or 4 different fronts on all of these issues. So I think you will see more and more use of regulatory authorities. It is so much easier to get passed. It is quicker. It is more efficient, and you can have a lot of impact in that way, especially, you know, with this group for financial regulation. Now, the rub of that is it isn't permanent. It's very sticking, in the same strike of a pen that the Trump administration used to put forth regulations, the Biden administration can use to undo them. So I think as they continue to hit they haven't hit roadblocks in Congress yet, but as they start to hit some of these roadblocks and see these deep divides, it'll be easier to make some of these changes around the edges that can be meaningful and can be impactful and do not become center stage fights that everyone's tuning into 24-hour news for, but can make some impactful moves on the regulatory front through the agencies.
So, you know, even with regulatory action, even with executive action, you know, he's going to have to navigate progressives and moderates. Patti, you referenced the, you know, 3 trillion is too much. No, 10 trillion is what we need, you know, all that noise. Where is the power on the Hill right now? You know, when you look at the House and the Senate, progressives, moderates, geography, all that sort of, what's your, you know, who's sort of in charge? I mean, politically, not obviously the speaker is in charge, but the majority leader is in charge. But
yeah, I think when you have such a slim majority, both in the House and in the Senate, any one person can really sort of, you know, bring upheaval into your entire into the entire Biden agenda. And I think one of my favorite quotes of Joe Manchin was just a couple days ago when he said that he thought the corporate tax at 28% was just too high. He's more for 25%. And he basically ended the quote by saying, and you know, if I'm not for it, it's not going anywhere, because because we've only got, you know, if you lose one vote, you've lost the piece of legislation. And truer words were never spoken. So I do think that when these margins are so slim, any Joe Manchin can really sort of ruin it. So I think for Joe Biden and his administration, and by you know, we just learned from Senator Schumer or from the parliamentarian that they think they can get this infrastructure bill done in reconciliation again, which obviously is very helpful. But as I mentioned earlier, I think the intra-party between the Democrats is really going to begin to play out more vigorously, more rigorously in the months ahead. I think the far left has been very disciplined and very well behaved thus far. I don't think that's long lasting. I think Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and some of the more moderates, the Problem Solvers Caucus, have also been extremely patient, but are losing patience with how much the Biden administration is supposedly giving to the progressives. So I think it's starting to bubble up, and the Democratic Party is not going to seem as disciplined as it has been over the last 2 years.
So turning to sort of some of the policy issues, Doug and Lanhee, what would, you know, thinking back to both the K-shaped recovery as well as your observations about, you know, it's been a pretty long time that there's a significant portion of the country, of the economy, that feels like they've been left behind. What would you point to in the Biden agenda and the proposals that are really intended to address that, and how you think they're going to, you know, fare on the Hill?
Well, why don't I start, and then Doug, if you've got any thoughts on that. I think that obviously, if you look at the large infrastructure jobs package that was just proposed by the president, a lot of that is really intended to address not infrastructure specifically. I think infrastructure is a component of it. But if you look at all of the elements of it, there is an effort to look at, in particular, how to boost lower wage jobs, how to think about this sort of K-shaped dynamic that Doug's talking about. So, you know, the single biggest component of the American Jobs Plan, which was the proposal that Biden introduced, is actually a massive expansion of home health care spending, right? And a lot of people don't realize that because it's been branded so much as an infrastructure bill. Well, the reality is that a big component of it is trying to boost, in particular, wages for home health aides, which are notoriously low and are set by states through their state Medicaid programs, which are chronically underfunded, right? So what you're seeing is this is as much about full economic recovery by using the spending power of the federal government as it is about any specific component of the package. Yes, there are massive infrastructure upgrades that the bill calls for. Infrastructure, both physical infrastructure as well as technological infrastructure, and those are important components. But part of, I think, where the Biden team's heads are at is that they believe government has to be more aggressive in taking a front row seat to boosting economic recovery via fiscal stimulus. And that is a position that this administration has taken. In part, they believe it's a learning from the 2008-2009 period when they don't think that the government did enough to boost long-term economic recovery. And we ended up in a period of relatively slow economic growth as a result. So I think what you're seeing here is a reaction to that time, but also a reflection of the fact that Democrats hold all the reins of power. And to Patti's point, they can essentially pass whatever their caucus will allow them to pass. And I think you're seeing that.
Doug, any?
Yeah, so I always try to oversimplify things, so I will now oversimplify things. I think the prism from which you should look at everything on our American politics right now is through the fault line in American politics right now is populism on the one side, left and right, and globalization on the other side. And that is the fault line from which everything you're looking at, you should interpret. As just to build on what Patti said earlier, Biden ran on and is acting as president, 3 pillars for his administration. First, as Patti mentioned, is controlling the virus. Second is the economic recovery. And I'll come back to that in regards to foreign policy and trade in a minute. That's the first bucket. The second is racial and economic equality. And the third is climate change. And he views the whole of government, everything is interconnected in terms of how you deal with these problems. And as Lanhee says, with an aggressive whole of government approach. So if you look at the $1.9 trillion spending, which the Republicans will characterize as 25% on infrastructure and 75% on Green New Deal, whatever. But if you just look at a pie chart, we have it, by the way, we can send it to you. You can see that Biden's administration's priorities in those 3 buckets are reflected in how he spent money on this package of 1.9 trillion. And by the way, he's got at least one more package coming behind this, which will even be more geared towards racial and economic equality, climate change. The last thing I'll say is it ties into foreign policy. You're going to see, you're already seeing it. Priority 1 was controlling the virus, getting the economy back. While this is an administration that can walk and chew gum, while this is an administration that has structure and process and engagement, you're not going to see Biden personally as president in the administration putting a lot of focus on foreign policy and trade this year. They say publicly that America's greatest weakness right now, greatest threat in the world right now, is internal. And so you will see, but it'll be down the road, the focus on foreign policy. But back to the fault line of populism and globalization, you're going to see a different approach than Trump from Biden. But a lot of the goals of Trump aren't going to change because of those pressures. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm oversimplifying, if you want to understand Biden's foreign policy in the world, I'd say it's built around, I would call it 2.5 countries. It's China, it's Iran, and Russia. And so when you look at all the moves they make or don't make, at the end of the day, those are the 3 countries or 2.5 countries that are driving, they're going to drive their foreign policy and their engagement with allies.
Can I just add one thing, not on the foreign policy, but on the domestic policy stuff? I believe that Biden specifically and some of his closest advisors are really heeding the words of Doug and my friend Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff to Barack Obama in the first term. And that is never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that the Biden administration really sees the opportunity for transformational change in legislation, and they are going big. They see this, again, as I said, transformational, but also legacy setting for President Biden. And they have control of the House and the Senate, albeit by a very small margin, but they're going big and they're going to try and do as much as they can. And that is one of their sort of driving forces.
Do you, not to open old wounds, but do you think the outcome will be different than it was, different from what it was with President Biden? I'm sorry, with President Obama and the healthcare plan, and I know the economic recovery was different. That is a distinction of really, going big. But if you kind of take these 2 points that you guys have made of an approach towards bipartisanship, where you say, it's not so much bipartisan here in the Congress, it's does the American public support this? Are things like, rural access to broadband and home health care, support for families that want to care for people at home, are those kinds of things going to be significant enough to heal those, to overcome those divides, or at least the, partisan divides on the Hill?
I mean, I certainly don't think so. I mean, I think that the elite narrative, if you will, the elite political narrative is going to continue to be divided because there are incentives, frankly, for both sides to trade off of that division. I mean, it's a very cynical view, I know, but that's just the reality of it. I think both sides benefit to a certain degree from the measure of polarization, and that filters down to the American people. Even if some percentage of Republicans, for example, think that elements of this package are a good idea, I would bet the broad majority still end up against it, not because the policy isn't what they want, but because they just don't like Joe Biden very much, or they don't like Democrats very much. And so I think that dynamic ends up being the more significant one, notwithstanding the policy proposals, which, I mean, Briget, I think you're right. Many of them should garner bipartisan support, and I think would otherwise be popular if we weren't living in this very polarized time.
It sounds ridiculous because it's supposed to be a connection between what people in America think and their representation in Washington. But right now there's a big difference. And I agree with Lanhee about representation in Washington at the federal level, both Democrat and Republican. We have a political structure and system in America right now which rewards partisanship. And so the people on the Hill are far more vulnerable to losing a primary from the left, from the Democrats, or the rights from Republicans than they are a general election. So the political structure in our country and the bailing wire right now holding the parties together is the opposition to the other party. Now, in the case of America, it's different. I think in America, they're like 1/3 of America are a bunch of crazy left-wingers, 1/3 of America are a bunch of crazy right-wingers, and there's 1/3, which I call the civilian population, that just want normal, decent government. And that's, to Patti's point, Biden, by historical terms, doesn't have tremendous job approval numbers, but relative to the last 4 years of Trump, he's doing quite well right now, largely because that middle third of the country, a lot of them are embracing what he's doing. But that's not going to translate, to Lanhee's point, I think, in different behavior in Washington and in Congress for the next 2 years, because we have a political system right now that rewards partisanship.
So now we're going to be a little bit selfish and parochial and focus on issues that are kind of the hot issues for IIB members. So want to start with Treasury Department and Secretary Yellen. The Biden administration, as part of their infrastructure package, which we've discussed, laid forth a way to pay for it, mostly by raising the corporate income tax rate, deterring offshoring, a couple other proposals. But with respect to sort of foreign, the secretary sort of has proposed this global minimum tax as an alternative to what the base erosion tax, which was a big part of the 2017 bill. We saw Senate Finance Committee come out with a proposal yesterday that did not include that, and we haven't seen much out of House Ways and Means. How's that all going to come together? What do you think about who's going to be leading on tax? I guess it's not tax reform. It's sort of like undoing tax reform.
Well, who wants to lead, or who's going to lead, or who thinks they're going to be leading? That's probably a very different way to look at it. So if we just back up and look big picture real quick, Secretary Yellen obviously will be the point in the administration on taxes. However, there will be a large assist from the White House, the National Economic Council, and the folks over there as well. They're looking at doing tax reform, as we've seen, in two tranches: the corporate, and that's going to be the pay-fors for the infrastructure tax or the infrastructure bill. And then down the road, I've heard maybe just in the coming weeks, they will be presenting more of a social welfare families economic bill that will be paid for much more on the individual side, individual tax rates. Think of anyone making $400,000 and over seeing a tax increase. That seems to be where they're landing on. As for the corporate taxes, I think they were smart to come out big on the hike in the corporate tax rate. Joe Biden campaigned on a 28%. I think most corporations out there would be able to say with a straight face, 21% was pretty darn low, and we got pretty lucky for a couple of years. And so everyone wins, right? If they settle on 25, which everyone seems to think they'll settle on, corporate America gets to come forward and say, we worked with the administration, we're willing to take this tax increase. President Biden gets to say, we won. We didn't get it all the way to 28, but man, we did a good job. And so I think there's a real opportunity for corporate America and the administration to work together on that. You know, where you're not going to see a lot of support are all the underlying tax provisions that you talked about, GILTI tax and corporate global minimum tax rate. That's what's making corporate America sweat right now. And that's what's making them nervous. And they'll say, hey, we'll take a hike increase, but you can't close down all these other ways that we remain competitive in the world. And so, again, Secretary Yellen laid this out yesterday. This was a big way to kick off Bank Fund Week meeting, to have something to talk about. And my guess is companies in Europe, many of your members would welcome a global corporate tax rate that's been negotiated, and American companies will not. So that means who actually holds, you know, who has the power at the end of the day? I would say it's Congress. It's going to be the Senate Finance and the House Ways and Means Committee who are writing this legislation. As you said, they came out with their own proposal yesterday. It touched on some of the foreign incomes issues and taxing export income, but it did leave corporate tax rates and others alone. And so I think they're setting themselves up to have a nice negotiation time over the coming weeks and months. They're inviting other ideas, other ways to come in. They didn't, you know, this was a blueprint. This was just a starting point. And so I think they do truly want to hear from a lot of different areas, a lot of corporations, but at the end of the day, I think the tax writing committees in Congress are the ones who wield the most power.
I'm just to jump in, I also think this is one of the areas where you're going to see a lot of voices from the left use their power to stir the pot, so to speak. So not just Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, but AOC. A lot of Elizabeth Warren's people are scattered throughout the administration, both at Treasury and the NEC. I expect a lot of theater in this area over the next few months.
So taking that sort of moving into climate via tax, so climate regulation, you know, really interesting topic for foreign banks, because we have members a lot of members in Europe, UK, where they're far down the road and using financial approaching it not just from the prudential regulation standpoint, but from the standpoint of advancing a policy in support of, you know, sustainable finance and moving away from greenhouse gases. Here in the US, our financial regulators to date have been much more careful to talk about approaching climate regulation from the standpoint of financial risk, prudential risk, and in part because of, you know, and have been really reminded of that by sort of a stream of letters from Senator Toomey and others. So one question is, you know, if you think of a free market way to approach climate policy, you would do a carbon tax, some kind of pricing of carbon, cap and trade. What are the prospects for that? Lanhee, I saw you shaking your head. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the prospects are particularly good. That having been said, I do think that there is a little bit more openness amongst some on the center right, at least, to a variety of proposals that have been put forward, for example, by the Baker-Stevenson task force and a few other what we might consider to be coalition efforts to advance, for example, some kind of a carbon tax. You know, I just think politically, the politics of the Republican Party make it difficult for proposals like that to gain broader traction than amongst a few targeted members. And, the answer may be at the end of the day, if the Democrats decide to proceed in a partisan fashion to advance legislation in this area, they will have the ability to do that, at least with part of the climate change agenda, without Republican support. It'd be better to have some Republican support. I just think it's unlikely that we'll see too much in the way of broad Republican support. And as I said, you might find one or two members of the Senate in particular, I'm thinking of, who would be open to something like that. But more broadly, it's still a pretty big lift because of the politics of climate change in America.
What we've seen a little bit of the administration's sustainability climate initiatives in the infrastructure package, but Patti, how do you think they're going to accomplish or move forward their, one of the main pillars, as you guys have pointed out, of the Biden plank was addressing climate change, getting caught up on that?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about it. First, the fact that he put John Kerry in charge really speaks volumes in terms of the area of importance and the priority for Biden on climate. This is a former senator, a former secretary of state, a former almost president, someone who's extremely close to Joe Biden. And he is in charge. And a little birdie told me that, at least as of now, John Kerry's staff is larger than Tony Blinken's staff. So that is just, at least for right now. I'm sure Tony's is growing. But so that tells you, as Doug said, this is indeed a top priority for the Biden administration. And my understanding, it is all, the work is all focused on getting to Glasgow in November and getting these commitments from foreign nations to make a real impact globally on climate and sustainability. And we'll see some announcements around Earth Day and their summit on the 22nd and 23rd, which will be run all virtually, but really tailored much like the convention was and the inauguration was, where they're going to show off their power to convene not just global political stakeholders, but their celebrities and academia, and make a big blowout. How it's going to actually get done, I'm going to maybe let Lanhee speak. It's going to be very, very difficult. They are going to look for partnerships, not only multilaterally across the globe, but also from corporations and financial institutions. Make investment in corporations who are making a commitment to climate and sustainability. They very much understand the limits of a government alone approach. So they are looking for partnerships, again, not just globally, but domestically in terms of businesses, corporations, financial institutions, et cetera, et cetera.
And if I can just add to that, this is when that's big picture climate, looking a little bit more towards Yellen's role in Treasury. And this is when we go back to one of the first questions, which was when to use regulation, when to use legislation. And so I think, banks, some of your colleagues over at the Institute for International Finance late last year put forth languages and statement that they were ready to work with the administration on climate and on financial disclosures around risk with climate change. They held a climate summit last month. And so you're starting to see financial institutions out there talking about this because they know the train is coming for them, right? And I think in a lot of cases, their leadership very much agrees with this and is ready to say, what do we need to be doing on climate? We have a role to play and we can in our own way. And European banks are much further along than the US ones. And so it's working together. But Gary Gensler is set for a Senate vote next week. He will be confirmed, absolutely no problems. Even if he will be confirmed, maybe it's a party line vote, he will be confirmed. And so he gets in, I think, right away looking at SEC, how they can work on disclosures to ensure there's there's enough risk management around climate change issues. And then in concert over at Treasury, Secretary Yellen had the first FSOC meeting last week, focused a lot on climate and on green finance and the role that they can play within this whole of government approach to helping climate change. So there's going to be a lot on it out of Treasury and the regulators.
Speaking of Gary Gensler and the SEC and climate and sort of the proposal that acting chair Lee put out requesting public input on mandatory climate disclosures. You've mentioned that racial equity, both in terms of, sort of diversity as well as fairness policies, especially in, the financial world is a high priority. What do you think about the fate of proposals to require more disclosure and sort of push for more diversity via disclosures like SEC mandates or mandatory disclosures, reporting by banks to their financial regulators?
I think it's something that's going to certainly get a lot of discussion. I think, if I remember correctly, Secretary Yellen was asked about this probably about 6 weeks or so ago at Deal Book. And I think, if I remember correctly, she kind of balanced, right? She said, I think these things are important. I don't know if this is mandatory, but I think this kind of information can be really revealing about institutions and how they operate. When I look at the financial regulators, I think of the words, consumer protections and giant words, and everything stems from that, right? If it's diversity, if it's inclusion, if it's equity, if it's fairness in the lending market. So I think Patti and Doug both talked about these kind of 3 pillars of the Biden presidency, and number 2 being equity and fairness and inclusion and diversity. And I think the regulators and Yellen are looking at everything through that lens. So will it be mandated? I don't know, but I think there's going to be a lot of talk and a lot of discussion around it. And even if there isn't regulation that mandates it, investors,
Good point.
others are going to push it to a point where it's going to be pseudo required by a corporation to make sure they're doing these disclosures, and they have diversity in their boards, diversity in their leadership, diversity in their thinking, their point of view. And so often, in some cases, the public gets there before the legislation or the regulation does, and this may be one of those.
So sticking on the, kind of financial regulation, banks did well through the pandemic, both in terms of, supporting customers, lending, the PPP program, but also in terms of safety and soundness. I mean, one takeaway could be that some of the Dodd-Frank reforms had their intended effect. How do you view the, new financial regulators? I guess we don't have a comptroller yet, but in terms of other appointees and what their approach might be around financial regulation, what their priorities are going to be?
Well, Rohit Chopra does not have a date for Senate confirmation at this point. That Gensler does, but someone said to me yesterday, the CFPB is back, baby. And I know that's not music to anyone's ears who's on this call, but again, it goes back to this centering around consumer protection. So I don't think there are large swaths of Dodd-Frank they're going to come and undo. We're way too far down that road, right? And the banks would even say at this point, hey, we'll trim around the edges, but we don't want that. So I think they're looking at it again through this lens of consumer protections and through and how can we do that, and with a large focus on climate. But I think, the CFPB has been fairly quiet for the past 4 years under Trump, and I think Katie barred the door.
Any other thoughts about financial regulation?
I'll say one quick thing and tie it back to climate. Just reinforcing something Molly said. The public leads the politicians. Our elected officials, once the line is formed, they're prepared to lead and get to the front of it. But our government, our elections are lagging indicators of where the country is. And just as it ties in from climate, which will be the dominant issue in our times 10 years from now, and issues around the banks. And I would say, first of all, on climate, Biden is up front. He is not operating with a free market. He is going to use the tax code to punish fossil fuel companies. He's going to use incentives in the tax code to reward green initiatives. And he's going to use as much pressure as possible from corporations and the public to force other companies and politicians to do what they consider the right thing. And they're going to enforce beyond the tax code, to what Molly alluded to earlier, the executive powers. And they're going to focus beyond those three buckets, very consumer or focus. I don't think most people in America have gotten the aftertaste of the 2008 financial crisis as it relates to their views about banks. And I think that the policies of the Biden administration are going to be driven by outcomes. And the last thing I'll say is I had to pick one argument that I don't want to be on the wrong side of going forward. It's transparency. I never want to be in a position where I'm trying to defend less transparency. That is a surefire loser in this environment.
This is a great way to end this discussion. So that is great advice. Your sort of closing words. I'm going to turn to the rest of you, just ask, you are in the advisory business, and I know clients come to you with all sorts of issues, crises, proactive, defensive, all different industries. We are bankers, but what's your sort of, any closing words of advice for IIB members as they think about this new administration and the really, really big changes that we're seeing, Patti, to your point, in very short order? So Patti? Oh, Patti might be frozen. Molly?
Sure. I would say, having spent 2 stints at the Treasury Department, they love data. They love information. And as much as you can come in and bring them hard data and analytics and information, not always with an ask, not always with a complaint, we need to do this different, this is better, but help to inform their thinking around these issues, that's exceedingly helpful to them. And I would just say that Treasury, there are a lot of partisan policy issues, but it's one of the most bipartisan places in the world to work. The career staff there is absolutely phenomenal. And when I left and came back in 7 years later, everyone from, deputy assistant secretaries to senior advisors to the janitor who was there every day were still there, and they're dedicated career servants, and they really are steady hands on the wheel, regardless of what the policies are that are going on. It's just, it's a place with really phenomenal, brilliant people. And they usually have, my experience there was, it's usually a very open door to hear from the industry in any way.
Lanhee?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that the typical alliances that we've become used to in politics, many of them don't apply anymore. And I think that's particularly true on the right, where I spend a lot of time. The typical sort of alignment of folks on, even an issue like corporate tax, which was fairly straightforward a few years ago, has become dramatically more complicated because of the introduction of these populist elements. And as Republicans position themselves to be sort of the heir apparent or, to the successor to the Trump legacy, I think elements of that are going to start to get very confusing. You're going to find Republicans that traditionally would have been allies are no longer allies. And that's just something you have to keep a close eye on as the tectonic plates shift. Staying ahead of some of that, I think, will be crucial as you think about how to best advance the agenda you care about.
our time is up. This has been great. We didn't have questions come in. People were texting me questions that I tried to advance. So I think we covered the waterfront, and we really appreciate, this is just such a great opportunity to have your experience and expertise. Thank you so much, and we'll stay tuned. Maybe we'll reconvene in a couple months and see how this is playing out, if your predictions and advice have held true. So
Well,
thanks
if
a
it's
lot.
not true, we'll schedule another one.
Yeah, sounds
you.
great. Thank you so much.
Bridget.
Thank Patti for us too.
Yeah, she's sorry.
I understood. It's our new world. Bye-bye.